Hey guys, it's Miss Young. We're going to be talking about the Civil War and comparing the Union versus the Confederacy. Make sure you have a blue marker and a red marker and a pen or pencil to write with, and let's get started. Alright, so what you have here is a Union soldier versus a Confederate soldier. At the top of the set of notes that are titled Union v. Confederacy, you see you have your two soldiers. On the Union side, okay, this is also the United States soldier. We start to reference this this part of our country, the divide. Remember, we've divided at this point. We started to refer to this as the Union now. Now, a Union soldier had nicknames. We called them Bluecoats, Yankees. Okay. On the right side, you have the Confederate soldier, and they had nicknames as well, called the Graycoats and the Rebels. All right, so directly below your soldiers, you'll see your map. You're going to take your blue marker, and all of the blue states that you see here, you're going to shade it in on your map. These are your Union states. Okay, these are your Union states. You're going to also want to make sure that you take care of your map key and show that the blue on the map is the United States or the Union states. And they're also free states. This is where slavery had been outlawed. Now, in the Union, while you're coloring, just listen and look. Multitask if you don't mind. In the Union, there was 22 million people in population. That's a pretty significant amount of people. They also had a capital. This was the capital of the United States. Now, notice how it kind of falls into the not quite so blue area, right? And it was Washington, D.C. So go ahead and make sure you label that as well. So shade in your Union states. Make sure you indicate that on your map key. Label your capital, and then wait, and then move on when you're ready. Now we have our Confederate states. So take your red marker and color in your red states. Also make sure you indicate the red means Confederate states on your map key. And these are the states where slavery was legal. And here we had 9 million people, including 3.5 million of them being slaves. So this is a huge difference in population. Now you're kind of wondering, why is it so different? Like the land looks bigger. Well, let me explain. Keep in mind, in the northern states, the primary economic activity is factories in the city, and the cities are overcrowded. You've got lots and lots of dense population. In the South you have farms. Well, you can't live like 3 feet from your neighbor because you got farmland in between you. And so they're spread out, or what we call sparsely populated in the South. And so yeah, you're not going to have as many people in the South. So this is going to become a factor when it comes to the Union soldiers versus the Confederate soldiers. And you know, we obviously know how it ends because we're considered the United States and not the Confederate States, but we get outnumbered and we get outwitted because we just don't quite have enough. Keep in mind, they have the factories in the North, so they can manufacture what they need for the war. We don't have factories in the South. Okay, so we have to make do with what we got. So we're not near as, we just don't got it together in the South for our soldiers. So go ahead and label your capital. Richmond, Virginia is the Confederate States of America capital. And when you're done coloring and labeling, move on when you're ready. All right, so now we have the border states. This is going to be the striped area that you see here. Okay, so go ahead and indicate stripes in your map key. Now, this is kind of a tough spot to be in for border states because you fall right between the Union states and the Confederate states. A lot of the battles take place here because that's kind of where the two halves mix. So it's kind of the more like the danger zone. But yeah, it's your border states. So go ahead and draw your lines. You don't have to, you can use your pen or pencil on this part. draw your lines and include your map key as well. All right, so now we have the territory. The territory is all these polka dots, okay? Now the polka dots are the regions or the region that has not necessarily been turned into states, but we own it. Okay, remember there is, under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787, there are some expectations in order for an area of land to become a state, like 60,000 people, already have an established self-government. So maybe these territories had not quite gotten to that point yet. They didn't have enough people living in them. And so, again, they're not states, but we still own them. So go ahead and draw your polka dots with your pen or pencil and move on when you're ready. All right, so let's talk about the Union people. Who are the key players in the Union? So flip your paper over and you will see a picture of the president of that time of the Union, which is Abraham Lincoln. And some of the key players of the Union are Ulysses S. Grant. He eventually becomes a president. He's really not a good president. The only thing he's good at is being a general of the Army. He's kind of got a nickname called Useless S. Grant because he really is not a good anything except a general of the Army. So he's appointed general-in-chief of the Army, of the Union Army during the Civil War, and he led the hard-won victory of Vicksburg, which you'll get to know later. The victory at Vicksburg is a big victory. It kind of seals the deal for him. Our next key player is William Carney. William Carney was a Congressional Medal of Honor recipient. This is a very big honor to receive. He served with the Massachusetts Colored Regiment. So at this time, you can imagine there were black men in the North who were willing to step up and fight for the freedom of their people in the South. And that's exactly what William Carney did. He was born a slave. He became the first black soldier to receive this award. It's a pretty big honor. And our final guy that you got to know is Philip Bazar. He was born in South America. Okay, so he's a Latino. Later became a native seaman in the Union Navy, and he also received the Medal of Honor. Very, very big deal. The main thing you need to know about these two guys is that they did receive the Congressional Medal of Honor. So let's talk about our Confederate soldiers. So the president of the Confederacy is Jefferson Davis. Our first key player is Robert E. Lee. Robert E. Lee was a legendary general of the Confederate Army. In June of 1861, Lee assumed command of the Army of North Virginia. Now, the Civil War started in 1861, so right about then is when he jumped in and started taking over the Northern Virginia Army. Now, keep in mind, Virginia is really close to the close to the Union states. So you can imagine that lots of action going on in Northern Virginia. He later ended up surrendering at the Battle of Gettysburg. This is kind of this is a huge hit for the Confederacy, kind of like the victory for Vicksburg, the victory for Union at Vicksburg. That's a big victory. Well, they also win Gettysburg too. And Robert E. Lee had to surrender there because he knew it was just going to be an obliteration. So, those are two huge contributors as to why the Union ended up sealing the deal. Our next key player and other key player for the Confederacy is Stonewall Jackson. He was considered a war hero. He was one of the Confederacy's most successful generals, and he served under Robert E. Lee. Unfortunately, he later died by what we call friendly fire, which is where a stray bullet from your own side ends up hitting you and killing him. But he gained this nickname because he was sitting on his horse, and some of his men were getting ready to quit, and one of his guys said, "Look at your general. He's like a stone wall," you know, and so that nickname stuck, and it kind of became his reputation. So go ahead and wrap up that bit of information on your people of the Civil War. Move on when you're done. So you're going to go ahead and glue down these notes. If you don't have your notebook on you, we will glue them down at a later time. But you will be gluing those down into the notebook as a set of notes. All right, so now we're going to switch gears a little bit. We need to talk about some major speeches that were given during this time period. So we're going to be using some reading resources and analyzing these speeches. So let's get ready. Before we can jump into these speeches and analyze them, we have to know some key vocabulary terms. So first, liberty. Liberty is personal freedom, whether as a group or an individual. Equality is having equality or same rights or treatment. Union, united, coming together or staying together as a whole. And finally is government, a system established for running a country with laws and constitution. And of course, there's other ways, there's other forms of government, and these are the definitions you need to know in order to be able to analyze these documents properly. Okay, so we're going to be checking out these primary sources, and we will answer some questions about them. All right, so the first speech we're going to analyze, you're going to look at the speeches that are, you got 3 speeches made by Abraham Lincoln. So take a look at the first inaugural address. I'm going to give you a second just to read that. Pause so you can read the entire first inaugural address of 1861, and then we will move on. Okay, so now that you have read the entire inaugural address, we need to figure out, what does it say about liberty? Okay, what does it say about being free or not being free? So take a look at the worksheet that you're using. It's called, What the Heck Does It All Mean? Okay, so what did he say about liberty? Go ahead and write in the blank what you think he said about liberty. Then I want you to write down, what does he say about equality? Next, you're going to write down, what does he say about union? And then finally, what does Abraham Lincoln say about government in his first inaugural address of 1861? So go ahead and write your information down, and we can move on to the next speech when you're ready. Okay, so our next speech is going to be the Gettysburg Address. So go ahead and take a second to read through that primary source, and then we will move on. All right, so let's figure out, what does this speech say about liberty and the freedom of the people? Then we got to decide, what does it say about equality or not having equality? What does it say about union and being united? And then what does it say about the government in the Gettysburg Address? So go ahead and write your answers down in the middle section of your worksheet for the Gettysburg Addresses of 1863. All right, the final speech we need to compare that Abraham Lincoln made is the second inaugural address. Go ahead and read through that primary source, and we'll move on in just a second. All right, so what does this speech say about liberty or freedom? Or what does it say about not having liberty? What does it say about equality or lack of equality? What does the second inaugural address say about union and being united, or maybe not being united? And finally, what does the second inaugural address say about government? Go ahead and write your answers down in the bottom portion of your worksheet, and then flip your paper over. All right, so you should have flipped your paper over, and we're going to have to cover the election of 1860 and compare the inaugural addresses of President Abraham Lincoln and President Jefferson Davis. Now, if you don't know what an inaugural address is, this is the speech that a president gives when they are first sworn in as president. It's kind of like their first words as president of the United States. And in this instance, we also have President Jefferson Davis's first words as the president of the Confederacy. So at the top of this paper, We just need to take down some information. So fill in what you see. What you need to know, and you already know, is that Abraham Lincoln created the Republican Party, and he was the first Republican. His whole platform was, he was under this label of Honest Abe, something you kind of learn in elementary school. And he opposed the extension of slavery to new territories, but not into the South. Now, when he first started out, he was not planning on stopping or getting rid of slavery. He was just going to stop the extension of slavery. He wasn't going to allow it to spread. But this still freaked the Southerners out, and they seceded anyways. Democrats, in the election of 1860, they could not agree on a candidate. Okay, the Northern Democrats had one, and then the Southern Democrats had another. So what ended up happening is the votes were split between two candidates, okay, the Democratic votes, and it allowed Abraham Lincoln to get 39% of the popular vote. So if you win with 39% of a vote, that's not majority. You still have 61% left. And so 61% of the country wanted a Democrat, but because they couldn't get their act together, it split it. So let's just say you had 30 Northern Democrat votes for one guy. You had 30 Southern Democrat votes for another guy. Well, your vote split between those two candidates, which allows Abraham Lincoln to have 39% of the popular vote and win the presidential election. So majority of the country didn't even want Abraham Lincoln, but he just happened to get the luck of the draw because the Democrats couldn't figure out which candidate they wanted in the running. So write that stuff down. And we need to also take a look at this box on how did the U.S. react to this election. So what we see is the South is outraged. Okay, duh, we knew that. South Carolina seceded and 6 states followed, forming the Confederate States of America, which is why we have President Jefferson Davis coming into the picture. So wrap up these notes, and we'll move on to comparing their inaugural addresses. All right, so you should now have in front of you the primary sources of the two inaugural speeches between President Abraham Lincoln and President Jefferson Davis. So I want you to start out by reading President Abraham Lincoln's speech. So go ahead and take a few minutes to do that, and then we'll move on. All right, now that you have read his speech, I want you to look at the box next to President Lincoln's face, okay? And I want you to just summarize it. Just narrow down the basics of what he is saying to maybe 2-3 sentences. And then I want you to decide, what does Abraham Lincoln, what is his message, what message is Lincoln giving the South in his inaugural address? And then, how does his views on the Union differ from the views of the South? Okay, so you should be able to get that information straight from the speech. Go ahead and answer those questions, and then we'll move on. Now let's read Jefferson Davis's speech. This is going to be interesting. You're going to see the difference in the approach that these men take, as well as their perspective on what's going on in our country at this time. So read Jefferson Davis's inaugural address. It's the bottom one. And then we'll move on. All right, so now that you've read his address, I want you to summarize it just like you did Abraham Lincoln's. At the very bottom, summarize Jefferson Davis's inaugural address, and then answer the questions. What is Davis telling the northern states in his address? What is he saying to the North? And finally, are Davis and Lincoln's addresses different? And explain. If they're not different, you think they're similar, explain how they're similar. When you're done with this assignment, just wait for further instruction. All right, so you're going to glue this down into your notebook as well. Make sure you're paying attention to which page it needs to go on to. I know this was a lot of information today, but these speeches come directly from TEKS that are required of you to be able to analyze and know exactly this type of information that we've had to analyze today. So Great job, and listen for what you got to do next.